This is the third and the last of our discussions of a close text reading of Lacan's Neurotic's individual myth. And we're at the third section of the paper where Lacan is going to speak at some length about an anecdote from the life of Goethe. So it's kind of odd, it's not, he's doing an interesting thing. I suppose that's the kind of thing Freud himself might do. You find this kind of literary, famous cultural example, but he will use it to exemplify some of the conceptual ideas that we've been dealing with so far, which really seem to revolve very much around this quaternary structure, whereby both the ego of the obsessional is split into its narcissistic, the facets of the narcissistic relationship with the mirror image and with a loved object or sexual object. So let's highlight a couple of points from how Lacan speaks about it. The story is of something that happens in the life of Goethe when he's 22 years old. And Goethe has a famous episode where he has a great deal of passion for a woman called Friederike Brion. And he remembers this well into his old age. Lacan says this passion enabled him to overcome a curse that had been put on him. So Friederike Brion is a person whose love and whose relationship or whose memory helps poor old Goethe get over a curse. And where did the curse come from? Well, one of his previous loves, Lucinda, had by name had involved him in a curse or put a curse on him. And this curse came from a certain situation, and it involved an amorous attachment to other women, in particular against kissing on the lips. So poor old Goethe got himself into a situation when he got kissed or kissed someone on the lips and then had a curse placed on him. Unfortunate. How did that happen? Well, he was pretty keen on Lucinda. Lucinda had a sister who was rather shrewd, says Lacan. And the sister was busy convincing Goethe of the devastating effect that he was having on this girl, Lucinda. So we've got a bit of a naughty, conniving sister here. She pleads with Goethe, go away, you're causing all sorts of problems with poor Lucinda. You're like a bad influence, basically. She pleads with him to go away and to give her, the sly little minx, says Lacan, the token of the last kiss. So I don't know, Goethe wasn't really obviously thinking clear at this point, but so he gives this kiss to Lucinda's sister. Lucinda surprised them and said, what are you doing? I thought you were my boyfriend. I'm so sorry, Goethe. This is probably not how you would like this story to have been, immortalized or anything. But anyways, so Lucinda's very upset about this. And she says, may those lips be cursed forever. May evil befall the first one to receive their tribute. So Goethe's in a bit of hot water, he's in a bit of trouble, he's been cursed, and the whole possibility of him having any kissing fun in the future is now imperiled. It's not a great situation to be in. It's kind of like saying, man oh man, any hopes you've got of any sexual good time, happy jouissance moments, they're now cursed. So Goethe takes this curse as a sanction that will henceforth bar the way to all his amorous undertakings, says Lacan. He tells us then how, elated by the discovery of this charming girl, Friederike Brion, he succeeds in overcoming this prohibition. And he feels the ecstasy of triumph following on this fear of something stronger than his own self-imposed internal prohibitions. Okay, so Goethe is going to now give us, now we're going to hear how he gets to the situation. The self-imposed internal prohibition against any kind of sexual happy times, which sounds a bit like repression, is there, and now we've got to figure out how he does this. So now we have this story of presumably what happens after this little anecdote, and Goethe is living in Strasbourg. He's been aware for some time of this little village, and he wants to go and visit this place. He's been long aware of the existence in a small village of an open, kind, friendly family of Pastor Brion. So he's going to go off and do a little adventure. Maybe he's recovering from this horrible curse incident. And he describes all of this in his autobiography. Actually, says Lacan, when one looks at the details, one cannot help being astonished at the truly contorted structures they reveal. Now, when we hear Lacan talking about truly contorted structures, I think he's telling us that we can read elements of Goethe's life, and particularly this little adventure or misadventure, as playing out a complicated scenario, not too different, in fact, structurally the same as the situation that we see the rat man involved in. So he decides he's going off on this little road trip, and he's going off to, what's the name of the place? This little village. and he wants to hide something about himself. He has some comrades, and he wants to go in a disguise because actually he's the son of a grand bourgeois from Frankfurt, but disguised among his comrades by his smooth manners, so on and so forth. He disguises himself as a theology student in an especially seedy and torn cassock. So we have a question. Why does he want to do this? Well, maybe he wants to be undisguised. Maybe he wants to live a little life and sow his wild oats or whatever. But interestingly, he doesn't just pick a kind of mild disguise. He puts on a seedy and torn cassock. So he sets out. They have a lot of laughs, full of laughter on the way. But of course, he's very soon vexed at the reality of a visibly dazzling charm of a young lady against the background of the family. So now he's gone on his trip. He's dressed in his seedy and torn cassock, which, of course, I know you've already seen it, but this is now an example of the splitting that we spoke about earlier. Okay, here's the ego. Maybe that split that's reenacted is the narcissistic split of the subject and its mirror image. But here the split seems to be between him and a seedier, torn cassock version of himself, a mere theology student. So sorry to all the theology students out there, but you're just not quite as smart as the grand bourgeois from Frankfurt, Goethe is. So he's got this split, but now when we see the split, and we saw this earlier, now there's a sexual object. There's a charming young woman. Now, of course, he's got a little bit of a situation on his hands because he's dressed down rather dramatically in the seedy outfit and says, Lacan, he must change as quickly as possible. He must change out of this astonishing costume, which does not show him to his best advantage. Then says Lacan, the justifications he gives for this disguise are very odd. He invokes nothing less than the disguises the gods put on to come down to mere mortals. This seems to clearly indicate something more than a self-conceit, something bordering on florid megalomania. If we look at the details, Goethe's text shows us what he thinks about it. By this way of disguising himself, the gods sought above all to avoid vexation, and to put it bluntly, it was for them a way of not having to take the familiarity of mortals as insulting. Back to Lacan, or continuing Lacan, what the gods risk most when they come down on a level with humans is losing their immortality. And precisely the only way of avoiding that is to put themselves on their level. Okay, so just interestingly here, one way of reading what we've just heard is that the split that Goethe enacts on his own being, I suppose we could say, or on his own appearance and his own image, is his own ego, it reverberates with this split that when the gods put their disguises on to hang out with the mere mortals. Now, two things to note about that. When we talk about the gods and his potential somewhat identification with gods, that seems to indicate a high degree of a narcissistic relationship to one's self. Okay, I'm godlike at some level, which fits with the mirror stage when we think about the ideal ego, the beautiful, narcissistically appealing version of myself. But then we also have the other version of oneself, which here is put at a lower level, the level of mere mortals. Now, when we've thought about Lacan's mirror stage, we know about this mirror, mirror on the wall tension, this libidinal ambivalence between the image that I love and the image that I hate. But here it's given not just that loading, but there's also a kind of hierarchical question here of the split. So it's not just the idealized ideal ego, the lovable image of myself, and the scary, threatening image that threatens me with the breaking apart in pieces. It's not just love and hate. There seems to be a hierarchical distinction that is being smuggled in here, and that hierarchical dimension, I think, is important. So just a little parenthetical remark. Earlier on, I said, well, what do we say, or how do we think about this, the structural configuration of obsessional neurosis, how that might be populated by contingent historical details? And I'm starting to wonder whether that potential split between Goethe as super duper Goethe, grand bourgeois, whatever, and mere theology student with the cloak that is, what does he say, seedy and torn cassock, and now the distinction between gods and mere mortals. I'm wondering whether in certain circumstances that hierarchical split that occurs within the subject's own ego could be thought to play out in racialized terms, because there we have a hierarchy of, certainly within the culture of racism, one category of race is elevated, is thought to be narcissistically, whatever, superior, is highlighted, closer to God, to use the Goethe's terms, and the other which is not. So there's nothing to suggest that as such in Lacan's paper, but I think it's an interesting historical context that could be applied to how he reads it. Back then to Goethe. Okay, so now he's got into the situation of dressing down, meeting the girl of his dreams. Sorry for all the cliches, Goethe. I apologize. And now he's got to go back to Strasbourg and sort himself out because, hey man, I don't want to be wearing a seedy cassock when I meet the girl of my dreams. He comes back then, says Lacan, to Strasbourg, but far from following through on his wish to return to the village ceremoniously arrayed, he arrives at nothing better than substituting for the first disguise another disguise, a disguise that he borrows from a servant boy at the inn. This time he will appear in a disguise that is even stranger. Okay, wait a minute. He had originally a disguise that was questionable because he was wearing the seedy cassock. Then he has a situation when he sees a wonderful girl and wants to impress her. So his solution? Well, go back home and get an even worse disguise. So, I mean, it's funny. And again, you could say that in the response to this situation, the split is actually amplified because rather than just having an outfit which makes him a mere theology student as opposed to the young Goethe, now he's going to dress up as a servant boy. So the hierarchical difference is kind of redoubled. It's amplified. And that seems significant. And let's also bear in mind this dimension that we've had throughout, that when we have a conflict in obsessional neurosis, a conflict between me and my image, then it kind of seems to be redoubled because now I also have a conflict with a sexual object. But now it's almost like there's a third movement. I have a conflict between myself and my less than ideal image. That gets echoed at the level of a sexual relation. And now we have the moment where the potentiality of a sexual relation, a desirable young woman, does what? Takes him back to the beginning where he now makes an even worse disguise. So you get where I'm going with it, but there's something about the circularity or the repetitive nature of a dilemma which exists, which is transposed or leads to another level of dilemma. And that second level of dilemma bounces back, reverberates again at the first level, which kind of entrenches the conflict and keeps it happening at different levels. And that idea of a conflict that reverberates or moves between different levels obviously sounds a little bit like what we've been saying is the function of a myth in Claude Lévi-Strauss. Remember the idea that the real of a certain impossibility in myth is elevated to a higher order of the real, a higher order of impossibility. Maybe there's a slight difference there, but let's keep those ideas in play. Back to Strasbourg with the young Goethe. This time he will appear in a disguise that's even stranger. To be sure, he treats the whole thing as a game. But this game becomes more and more significant. In fact, he no longer places himself at the level of a theology student, but slightly below. He plays the buffoon. And all of this is deliberately entangled with a series of details which create in all those who collaborate in this farce a sense that this is happening. What is happening is closely linked to sexual behavior, to a kind of courting display. Okay, so just to highlight this game, this scene, this thing that's being played out, this long, circuitous, complicated enactment, again sounds like the Ratman and this strange configuration of elements that he does when he tries to get his glasses. There's something of this playing out situation which is noticeable, which feels neurotic, and we see it here. Okay, but that's not the only thing. Again, we have, and maybe this helps us, right? The split that happens at the level of the ego, of the obsessional. How do you resolve it? You resolve it by finding your split. How do you resolve your split? Fellas, you have a split, get an object. You get an object, the object will help you, your obsessional, and your object will help you, you think, resolve the split. But alas, the problem is the split gets redoubled in the very object that you try to get to solve your split. That seems to be what's happening. So earlier on, I mentioned that you have a conflict, a problem, and then it gets reduplicated at another level, which suddenly emerges in the context of this dilemma. But now we understand why it emerges, because the obsessionals move in relationship to their castration, in relationship to their split, is to find the object. The only problem is that the object invariably ends up getting split and creating problems all of its own. Lacan carries on with the Goethe story. He says there's some problems in his story, he says. He says, the ardor of those I mentioned earlier, who follow the tracks of great men, has demonstrated the inaccuracy of certain details, which are all the more revelatory of what one might call the real intentions of the entire scene. So there's some things that are either incorrect or not substantiated or that seems to not be quite accurate in the case of how Goethe tells the story, and those facets are important. For example, he involves in his narrative, he's got the clothes of a servant boy, and he now plans to deliver a christening cake. Now, this seems a little bit of an odd moment in Lacan, because he's like, but we can show that there were no baptisms in that locality. The christening cake is a bit of a ruse. It didn't seem to have existed. Why is he using it? And here, Lacan does a very sort of, I think, kind of brilliant psychoanalytic thing. He says, well, okay, we know that there'll be these odd features in the after the fact narrativization of a kind of phantasmatic scene, an important point in and of itself. But he says, well, what can this christening cake, this traditional gift to a pastor, mean? And he says, well, it can only be in Goethe's fantasy, and as such, it assumes in our eyes entire significance. Isn't that funny? The thing that obviously isn't true assumes its entire significance, a greater significance. It implies, he says, and here's the brilliant part, the paternal function, but precisely in so much as Goethe specifies that he is not the father, but only one who delivers something and who has only an external relationship to the ceremony. He makes himself the petty officer, not the principal hero. In the end, the whole ceremony of this concealment actually appears not only as a game, but much more profoundly as a precaution which can be placed in the category of what I have called before the splitting of the subject's personal function in the mythic constructions of the neurotic. Okay, inhalation. So now he is a petty officer, not the principal hero. So we spent some time talking about that. He's the petty officer, not the principal hero. And we've noted the hierarchical shift and why the question of why he's the petty person. Did he become a beggar at some point? So there's something of interest here. And I'd asked the following question. I said, well, we have the quaternary structure. The quaternary structure of the obsessional subject and its narcissistic relationship with its alter ego, and also the object that is called upon to deal with this split is likewise split. So there we have four positions. But one of the questions that emerges is, why does the subject in the split of its ego, or Goethe more particularly, have this slightly wretched position? And the echo here seems to be of a question that I asked earlier. Does this position that the subject places themselves in, this more subservient role, not correspond to a more senior role? Remember, I said, what is the hierarchical element here? And I think that what we're saying is that in the same way, or in a similar way, to which the split of the subject's ego calls forth an object at a second level, which is then split, we could also say that the subject who is split also calls forth something at a higher level, and maybe that's something akin to the paternal function. Differently put, when we are confronted in Goethe's story with the dilemma of him suddenly assuming a very subservient role, the servant boy, whatever, does that not tell us that the way that this ego is split also implies a further higher order hierarchical element, maybe a symbolic element that exists at a higher level? And I think it does. And I think this will now link to the question of what is a father, or what is a progenitor, or what is the name of the father or maybe indeed the master that the obsessional relates themselves to. So while Lacan does a great job of giving us a difficult job, but a useful job of giving us a quaternary structure, I'm now suggesting that the backdrop to the quaternary structure, I guess Lacan's suggesting it too, is that the quaternary structure itself takes place in the context of a brigada, or let's be more precise, in terms of some kind of father function. So let's see how Lacan puts this. Let's give a quote on 422, which will bring to a close the third section of Lacan's essay. Um, we see when he confronts his goal, the splitting of the subject, his alienation from himself, strategies by which he provides a substitute for himself on whom the deadly threats are to be carried out. The moment he reintegrates the substitute into himself, it is impossible to reach the goal. Okay, so that's kind of replicates part of what we have spoken about. Um, Interesting, he says. Okay, so I don't know exactly how he sorts out his dilemma, but presumably the delightful young woman that he meets is going to eventually be Frederica, the one who resolves the curse. But then, in a slightly wicked moment, Lacan can't help himself. He says, "Well, just bear in mind that there is a sister. Frederica herself has a double who is likely to complete the mythical structure of the situation." So even though he finds this like heroic further element, the nice girl, so to speak, this girl also has a double. The obsessional can't help but being split into another, and can't help, it seems, but split their sexual object into another. Okay, so that's quite useful. Let's now point to the very last section of the essay. Before doing that, I just want to highlight a couple of notions that Owen Hewitson stresses in his essay on commentary on Lacan's The Neurotic's Individual Myth. Okay, he says, we can see in the elaborated expression of the contradictory obsessional, I think he's referring to the quaternary four-part structure. In this four-part structure, we can see an inability to bring together two levels that we saw above, and this permeates the obsessional's life. So the quaternary structure involves two splits, and two splits that occur at different levels that can't be reconciled. Hewitson gives us three assertions. He says, the split in this quaternary structure, which permeates the obsessional's life, can be seen in various clinical manifestations, in affect symptomatology of guilt, self-reproach, and doubt. That's one example. Number two, in the mechanisms that animate these manifestations, reaction formations, isolation, and undoing. That's number two. And number three, through the obsessional's personal relationships, avoidance of a situation of competition in their career, for example, or the splitting of the object into one that is loved but not desired, and another that is desired but not loved. That's number three. So Hewitson's moving rather quickly there, but this is basically the suggestion he's making, which I think Lacan himself is making. Lacan is saying, once you've understood the quaternary structure, and that, to reiterate, is a split at the level of the obsessional's ego and at the level of the obsessional's objects. Once you understand that and irresolvability of the two levels of this dilemma, despite that the obsessional might overlap them, they're irresolvable, there are two different levels, we can start to understand not just the split in their relationships that we've discussed, but also some of these more long-standing clinical manifestations, affective symptomatology of guilt, self-reproach, mechanisms, reaction formations, isolation, undoing. These also make sense once we bear this quaternary structure in mind. I mean, so it's almost like some of the more, the obvious, clear clinical manifestations that Freud has already spent a lot of time thinking about, the dynamic drive and affective dimensions of obsessional neurosis can now, so says Lacan, be understood in a more structural dimension when you have grasped this quaternary function. So kind of a big claim. I hope it works out. I think that's the argument that's being made. Maybe we could ask some questions about it. But back to Hewitson's reiteration, he says, in Lacan's view of obsession, we've got those four characters. Four positions to be filled, which constitute the quaternary structure. The obsessional, his double, another man, for example, his lover, and the object of his romantic yearnings. In the rat man's case history, he fills these positions with characters that mirror each other in the lives of both the rat man and the rat man's father. And Hewitson gives us a nice diagram, which I won't replicate here, but I'll just describe it to you. On the top left-hand corner of our quaternary structure, we have a subject, and that's going to be a barred subject. And then we'll have a lateral line joining that to subject who's also barred, prime, subject one, okay? And that would be something like the subject's relationship to their alter ego. And then at a lower level, you draw an arrow down from the top left to give us the object. And I suppose that'll be an object, a sexual object. And then on a further horizontal line, parallel to the top one, you'll have a line, an arrow, which will be object prime, the split part of the other object, the split part of object A. So it'll be A prime. So that's the quaternary structure. Um, Lacan does make this remark. He says, I think that this difference, and the difference here is between Oedipal triangulation and the quaternary of the obsessional's economy, ought to lead us to the question, ought to lead us to question the general anthropology derived from an analytical doctrine as it has been taught. In short, the whole Oedipal schema needs to be re-examined. That's a big claim from the heart, within the heart of psychoanalysis, considering how formidable and how substantial the Oedipus, the Oedipal configuration and Oedipus dilemma has always been. Now Lacan maybe staking a claim on future fame and whatever in the psychoanalytic world is to say that you need the quaternary understanding more so than a three-part understanding. Certainly so in the life of obsessional neurotics. To disregard it is to disregard the most important element in the treatment itself. You will essentially misconstrue and potentially mess up the clinical work with an obsessional neurotic unless you understand that treatment. Okay, so here we go. How does this now have anything to do with the paternal relationship? Well, still staying with Hewitson, he says, the established Freudian Oedipal explanation for when something goes wrong and neurosis resists is that there's been a failure in the paternal function. Okay, that makes sense. The real father, the father as a person, fails to coincide with his symbolic function. In obsession, we see that this happens in the form of a splitting of the father. His actual role fails to match up to the symbolic role that he has to assume. And then Lacan gives us some examples of how this may happen. So let's give some of those, but just to, again, reiterate the context, we've given the quaternary structure, and I've suggested that the quaternary structure itself either occurs within the context of a paternal or, let's say, of an Oedipal relationship, but this being Lacan, we're focusing here more on the paternal element, and we'll see why. This four-part structure either occurs in the context of a paternal relationship or paternal or Oedipal relationship, or indeed, it's almost as if the quaternary structure would actually be a six-part structure. But that Lacan doesn't say that. That's my addition. Probably makes more sense to say that it occurs from within that context. So this is a theme that is very important in Lacan, and it's there as early as family complexes, which was still written, prior to his proper psychoanalytic work. He's not even properly psychoanalytic, you could say, at that point. But the key theme that the figure who functions as a father, and not just in the kind of whatever biographical sense of a father, but the person who stands as the representative of a function of a father, and the function of a father within patriarchy presumably means someone who's associated with law and a certain amount of power or authority. That figure is always not quite up to the task, or there's an imbalance. But anyways, that's the theme that we see again and again in Lacan. And I suppose it makes us think that there's a real dimension to being a father, in as much as any father would seem to be not quite able to match up to an ideal father or the ultimate symbolic function of the father. There's always an inbuilt disparity there. So let's just get this remark, okay? The assumption of the father's function presupposes a single symbolic relation in which the symbolic and real father would coincide. This is page 423. The father would have to be not only the name of the father, but also the representative in all its fullness of the symbolic value crystallized in his function. Now it is clear that this coincidence of the symbolic and the real is totally elusive. Okay, a lot of words. What are we saying? We're saying that there is a person who is a father. I'm actually, funnily enough, a father, and I will, in some sense, fail to ever live up to whatever the symbolic dimension of the office of paternity, the office of being a father, capital F, might be. There'll be a kind of mismatch. And he puts it here quite nicely. He's still using name of the father without capitals, so it's the concept is under formation here. But he says, this coincidence of the symbolic and the real is totally elusive. And I would say symbolic and the real, let's read it here as not real, Lacanian real, but the failure of a perfect harmonization or coincidence of the literal figure of the flesh and blood father with what the symbolic role of paternity and the capital F father might be, those things don't fully harmonize. Um, at least in a social structure like ours, the father is always in some way, some way or another, in disharmony with regard to the function. A deficient father. So that's like a crucial point. Okay, the father is always in one way or another in disharmony with his function. And just to say, that doesn't mean that you simply have inept fathers, although there's plenty of them. Hello. It might mean that you've got very good fathers, which is still possible, but that there will still then be a split. I mean, it's kind of a structural impossibility to overlap completely the father in the imaginary realm and the father in the symbolic realm. That's, I think, the point that's being made here. There is always an extremely obvious discrepancy between the symbolic function and what is perceived by the subject in the sphere of experience. Okay, so he's made that point a couple of times, and as have I. So it seems to be pretty important. Hewitson gives us a whole series of examples of where we could see that happening. These are more contingent examples: the death of a father, and then the stepfather comes in to take on the relationship as one, maybe an older brother who acts as the father. We could think of Freud's own family circumstances there, says Hewitson, or we can think of the rat man whose father gets himself into all this trouble with a gambling debt, and then this elusive friend bails the father out, saves the father, enables the father still to be a father, thereby also demonstrating the rat man's father's ineptness, I guess, as a father. So we can think about all these different examples. And doing so would be important because there will be an almost infinite variety of how the father function fails in the given case that one is working with as a clinician. But I would simply say that while we can find many examples of that, it's also in Lacan's sense that there's a structural incompatibility and impossibility in assuming that role in any perfect way anyways. So now we have a different and distinctly Lacanian reading of something about the Oedipal complex. Back to Hewitson. What Lacan adds to the standard Oedipal explanation is the additional complication of the narcissistic relationship. It's this that moves us beyond the Oedipal triangle, father, mother, subject, towards the quaternary structure of the obsessional. How to put that differently? You've got an Oedipal situation, but that Oedipal situation will also pivot, certainly so for Lacan. You could say that a real crucial pivot for the Oedipal situation is the father's ineptness to ever live up to the symbolic father. So the inherent discrepancy in paternity as such, that is crucial to how he reads the Oedipus complex, so much so that how one situates oneself in relationship to the name of the father is one way. It's kind of a shorthand Lacanian way of thinking about the Oedipus complex. And just before you say, where's the mother in all of this, you could say that the name of the father is, of course, related to the paternal metaphor of the desire of the mother. That's not spoken about here, but presumably we would have to say that that is one way of approaching how the name of the father functions at all, in as much as it is a kind of a metaphoric replacement for the desire of the mother. Now, that's another whole lecture, but just to say, the point is that this theory of the name of the father becomes, at a certain point in Lacan's work, a way of thinking the Oedipus complex. And the point that Hewitson is stressing here is that what Lacan wants to impress upon us is two things. You could think about the crucial dilemmas of the name of the father or the father's inability to live up to the symbolic father as one way of thinking about the Oedipus complex, or a facet of the Oedipus complex. And this dilemma is itself linked to this other dilemma of the narcissistic relation, the mirror image that the obsessional has with their alter ego. So we've got both of those things happening in tandem. And I think, as complicated as that may be, it does help to bear it in mind, because the rat man's dilemma is not simply about the rich girl, poor girl. It's also always and as much about what the father was not able to do properly, what the father was not able to do properly. And okay, that replays it. Okay, so we've said a lot about that. Let's see if we've got a final quote. We're on the last couple of pages now. And let's just say there's a little mention of Heideggerian philosophy that comes up here. The subject has its anticipatory relationship to his own realization. We're talking about, I think, the imaginary relationship here, which in turn throws him back at the level of the profound insufficiency and betokens a rift in him, a primal sundering, a thrownness, to use a Heideggerian term. So there's kind of a little meta-theoretical thing. This splits in the subject. He goes earlier on, he says, what is the ego if not something that the subject at first experiences as foreign to him, but inside him? It is in another, more advanced, more perfect than he, that the subject first sees himself. So we're talking about the rivalrous conditions of the subject's relationship, the ego's relationship to their own image, an image which is sometimes more accomplished than one. And I just kind of like the mashup, the overlap here between this Freudian and Lacanian idea of the ego in its rivalrous relationship to another, which is now transposed into the Heideggerian notion of thrownness, the primal sundering. Lacan says on page 424, it is in this sense that what is revealed in all imaginary relationships is an experience of death, an experience doubtless inherent in all manifestations of the human condition. So sometimes, I don't know if you've noticed this, but Lacan likes talking about death. Death comes up a lot. And I used to think, well, maybe this is just a thing that he's sort of dramatically interested in. But maybe the reference to Heidegger here is quite important, because saying Heidegger's thrownness is one version of what I'm talking about will also bring into the equation more prominently the role of death. We asked earlier about this question of what's fatal, why the necessity of that. And one of our answers is, well, that is part of the rivalrous, it's you or me dimension of the mirror stage element. Lacan says, 424, all of that results in the mythical quartet. Okay, we've described that at length. It can be reintegrated into the subject's history, and to disregard it is to disregard the most important element in the treatment itself. What is this fourth element? Its name is death. Now, we've already populated the quaternary with the two splits. So I guess now we're being told that the fourth element is death. So it's not quite clear to me where death would be, but I guess death would be the inherent potentiality in the split, in as much as the split involves a rival of sorts. But let's see what Lacan has to say about it. Death is perfectly conceivable as a mediating element. Before Freudian theory had stressed in the existence of the father a function which is at once a function of speech and a function of love, Hegel, in his metaphysics, did not hesitate to construct the whole phenomenology of human relationships around death as a mediator, as the third element essential to the progress by which man becomes humanized in his relationships with his fellow man. That sounds like a lot, but here's how I read it. Freud has this theory. Freud gives us an understanding both of the existence of the father, and I guess you could say he also, through Freudian theory, we understand something about a narcissistic relation. But what mediates that relationship is something, a function, is something which we already see in Hegel. Remember earlier I was talking about all these configurations in theory and in psychoanalytic theory. Well, now what seems to be happening is that Lacan wants to overlap or transpose or read in conjunction of earlier theoretical figure, conceptual figure of Hegel, which Hegel gives us famously master-slave, and master-slave relationship is mediated by the promise or the threat of death. Okay? And now that idea that death is a mediating element in how the subject relates, or how the slave and master relate to one another, that mediating factor is now brought back to how the subject relates to their ego other. There's also something else here. So death is perfectly conceivable as a mediating element. Okay, we got it. But before Freudian theory stressed in the existence of the father a function, which is once a function of speech and a function of love, we find in Hegel in his metaphysics. So just to note that, like, Lacan's doing a whole lot of conceptual moves at the same place here, at the same time. We've got the conceptual factor of this mediating element of death, which comes into play in Hegel. That is now transposed back into the subject relationship to themselves, their subject, or the ego's relationship to its images, to be more precise. But he also mentions the father there. So we could ask how that works. And is there a mediating factor of death? I suppose maybe in the Oedipal situation there is. That remains a little bit of an unresolved point for me. But now we're moving on to the last page of the essay. He says, what can we learn from Hegel? He says, something to bear in mind about Hegel. In order for this dialectic of the death struggle, the struggle for pure power to be initiated, in Hegel, death must not actually be actualized, since the dialectical movement would cease for lack of combatants. Death must be imagined. And indeed, It is this imagined, imaginary death that appears in the dialectic of the Oedipal drama. And it is also this death that is operant in the formation of the neurotic. And perhaps up to a certain point in something that goes far beyond the formation of the neurotic, is specifically the existential attitude characteristic of the modern man. That's kind of brilliant. He's saying two things, three things, probably four or five things. Death is a crucial figure in how we understand the mediation of certain human relationships. Bear in mind, it's a conceptual death. It's not a real death. It's an imaginary death. Because if it was a real death, that would bring the dialectic or the relationship to an end pretty soon. Now, this imaginary death features in the Oedipal drama, which gives us a bit of an answer to the question I posed a little while ago. Is there a mediating element of death in the subject relationship to paternity in the Oedipal situation? An imaginary death? Yes, I think we can say there is. But this death is also an element within how the subject relates to their own image and maybe beyond that. And of course, why is he stressing death so much? Not only because it's an inherent aspect of an imaginary relationship, and not only because it takes on a certain imaginary force in the rivalrous you or me imaginary relationship that the son has with the father, maybe the daughter too has to the father or the mother in Oedipal configurations, it's there as well. But when he says it applies also to the formation of the neurotic, specifically the existential attitude characteristic of modern man, what is he saying? He's saying that death as a mediating element is a particularly crucial thing in obsessional neurosis. It would take little pressure to make me say that what functions as a mediation in actual analytic experience is something similar to speech, to symbol, called in another language, an act of faith. Okay, so this is a big moment. We've not only seen this iconoclastic suggestion that it's not simply a three-part Oedipal relationship that is important for thinking the structure of obsessionality. We need to think of four-part quaternary relationship, but we're also now told that the fatal relation or death is a crucial mediating element. You can see why in some instances that is the case, both as an element of the imaginarized dimension of relations, but also in a sense that this is particularly activated and actualized in the phantasmatic disposition of the obsession. With one last remark on Goethe, to kind of finish up his paper and relate back to the lengthy biographical description, he goes, "It is therefore with the phrase of Goethe, his last, that I will express the wellspring of analytic experience with those well-known words he uttered before he plunged open-eyed into the black abyss, more light." So a nice rhetorical move to go back to Goethe, who clearly here is a kind of epitomization of an obsessional neurotic who's concerned with death and life and wants, at the very moment of death, more life.